talking about how the profit motive has sort of creeped in, and then we also have the initiative of the get tough rhetoric moving in. How could we say that that get tough rhetoric has passed down into the school systems as well?
Yeah, well, I think, the get tough mentality, which clearly manifested itself in the war on drugs and also manifested itself in the wave of mandatory minimum sentences and three strikes laws and all the rest, which helped to quintuple our prison population in the space of just 3 short decades. That mentality has showed up, in our schools through the zero tolerance type policies that we see, but also in the general attitude towards young kids of color. The idea that we just need to be tough on them so that they'll act right, right? But it's just so interesting that we don't have that same attitude to our young white kids. I think there's an understanding that more privileged kids, they need nurturing. They need support. They need to be inspired. They need to be introduced to a range of opportunities to kind of broaden their horizons. But in poor kids of color, the idea is, well, let's scrap the arts programs. Let's strip music. We don't need athletics. We'll just stick to the basics, and we're going to get really tough. And I think it's tragic. If we genuinely cared about poor kids of color as much as we care about their more privileged counterparts on the other side of town, our approach to education would be radically different, and certainly our approach to crime and punishment would be radically different. Really, this caste-like system that's been created is a school to prison pipeline.
Wow.
One that really ensures that from cradle to grave, some of us will never get the chances that others take for granted.
Wow. So, when you wrote your book, you used the term the new Jim Crow. So, could you explain for everybody what that exactly means?
When I say the new Jim Crow, I'm talking about the rebirth of a caste-like system that once existed in the United States. The old Jim Crow, I've learned since writing the book, is something that many people aren't familiar with. I would do radio interviews, and I would get callers who say, Jim Crow, what's that?
Wow.
Some of them were young people who hadn't been introduced to Jim Crow in any serious way in high school, and others were older whites who had actually managed to live their whole lives without ever knowing really what Jim Crow was. And the old Jim Crow, which was a term. The term Jim Crow came from a performer, a cartoonish-like performer that mocked Negroes in the South for their step and fetch it kind of ways. That term that was once used to describe a minstrel character came to describe a system of rules, laws, policies, and practices that operated to lock African Americans into a permanent second-class status in the South, denying them the right to vote, excluding them from juries, and authorizing legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. Well, the new Jim Crow is not explicitly race-based. On the surface, it seems to be colorblind, but this new Jim Crow operates nearly as effectively as the old one did. It shuttles poor kids of color from their decrepit, underfunded schools to brand new high-tech prisons. It operates through the war on drugs and our system of mass incarceration. Kids are targeted at young ages, stopped, frisked, searched by the police, arrested at dramatically higher rates for drug offenses, even though they're no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites.
Did you ever know someone who has fallen victim specifically to this type of system? Did that at all inspire your work or what you wanted to do?
You know, I met working as a civil rights lawyer. I represented lots of people who fell victim to the system and came to know them quite well. Um, but I think what is what has partly driven my passion is how much wrong I've done in my own life and never had to pay the kind of price that other folks have.
Yeah.
I experimented with drugs in my youth. I made mistakes. I shoplifted from a store. I made mistakes in my youth. There were times when I was troubled and struggling, and but I have been better off. Would I have been taught a lesson that I needed to learn by being put in a cage and discriminated against for the rest of my life? Or was I fortunate enough to have family and community, schools that supported me? I'm just really humbled by so many of the folks that I've met who, despite it all, despite having a record, despite struggling much of their life to find food and work and shelter, who have dedicated their lives to trying to ensure that nobody else has to go through what they've gone through. People like Susan Burton. She cycled in and out of prison for 15 years after she succumbed to a drug addiction after the Los Angeles Police Department killed her 5-year-old son. And after cycling in and out of prison for 15 years, when she finally got access to a drug treatment program and got clean, she decided she was going to devote the rest of her life to making sure nobody else would have to go through what she went through. And she started just by going down to Skid Row where the prison bus would just release women onto the street from prison, carrying nothing but like a cardboard box of their belongings. And she would go up to women, getting off this bus, total strangers, and say, just come home with me. You can sleep on my couch. You can sleep on my floor. You don't have to turn to the streets. I want you to be safe. And now she runs 5 safe homes for women, returning home from prison, providing job training, support, helping to reunify families. I mean, there are just amazing people that I've met along the way that keep me inspired doing the work that I do.
So, how would you say that we redefine our prison system and change it from being just a holding place to actually what it was intended to be, a rehabilitation thing? So, how do we change that?
I think we have to commit ourselves to the idea that we're going to end prisons as we know them.
Mm.
So it's not just about kind of tinkering with the system. It's about really rethinking what we're up to. And that requires a major shift in our perspective. It's not, if our goal is actually to ensure that this person who's made this mistake, perhaps a horrible, maybe even committed a horrible crime, isn't going to do it again and is going to learn from this lesson and actually become an asset rather than a liability to the community, how do we respond? How do we respond to that individual? I'm a big supporter of restorative and transformative justice programs and approaches. Now, restorative justice isn't, I think, right for all types of what we call crimes today. For example, what is a restorative justice approach to someone caught with marijuana? Restorative justice is about restoring the relationship between the offender and the victim and the community as a whole. Well, if you're caught with marijuana, who's the victim? We define that person as an offender, but who's the victim really? So I think, when it comes to drugs, we should be asking ourselves, why do we put people in cages to punish them for substances that we have made illegal only because we're supposedly so concerned about the harm these substances cause? If we're concerned about the harm they cause, then why do we inflict so much more suffering on people than the substances themselves actually cause? So I think we need to rethink why we criminalize some activities. And, in the case of drugs, shift to a public health approach for dealing with drug abuse and drug addiction. But if you're talking about violent crime or crimes like theft or serious, crimes where there is a real victim and an offender, a restorative justice approach, indicates that the victim is better off if we ask, what is it that can be done to make you whole and to repair the harm that's done? And if the offender is asked, what can you do to earn your way back into this community? And if the community comes together and is part of the process of ensuring that it's not, blame just isn't laid on one person or another, but that the community is restored and that there is some healing done that ensures that everyone is better off. And unfortunately, our system is focused only on punishment and isn't interested in rehabilitation and isn't really even that interested in the victim. All we do for the victim is tell the victim he's locked up, when often the victim needs much more.
Yeah.